And it looks good on our end, Mark.
Great. Okay, so I'm a professor at the University of Alberta, and I moved to University of Alberta in 1999, and I was there for about 10 years, and felt that we really weren't maybe getting as much attention in the ecology area. We had some really good stuff going on, and so I made the very foolish move of agreeing to organize and be the local chair for the International Conference on Conservation Biology that was in 2010. And it was a huge meeting, about 1,700 people in Edmonton. But just maybe 6 months before the meeting, I was advised that one of my responsibilities as chair of the meeting was to spend the carbon tax revenue that they collected from people who came to the meeting. So everybody who came to the meeting was assessed a $27 carbon tax to offset the carbon from flying to Edmonton and so forth. But like I said, I was then responsible for spending $75,000, and I hadn't a clue what I was going to do. So what people had done in the past was that they'd plant trees and that kind of thing. Well, Alberta's a terrible place to plant trees, and we have the Rocky Mountain forests, which are mostly lodgepole pine, and lodgepole's got about 150-year rotation, and then it all goes up in smoke. And I mean, it's a fire-maintained ecosystem. They have serotinous cones that pop open when they're burned and spreads the seeds. And then the other place where we have trees is in the north, in the boreal forest. And the boreal forest is notorious for being a fire-maintained ecosystem as well. And so, certainly there's carbon tied up for a while, but every 100 years or so, it all goes back into the atmosphere. So it struck me that maybe wasn't a good idea. And so I started learning about the carbon cycle on a global scale and where carbon was. So deep ocean sediments are where we've got more carbon than anywhere else. But for terrestrial systems, where we have more carbon than any place else is in the soil. And this is especially true in grasslands. So grassland soils are just incredible. So right now I'm in Treaty 6 territory in the Beaver Hills UNESCO Biosphere Reserve, which is in the Aspen Parkland. And our black soil profile is about 0.9 meters deep, meaning we've got this black, rich, full of carbon soil down almost a meter that has all accumulated since the Pleistocene, because of course the glaciers slipped it all off. So all of your Saskatchewan grasslands were all slicked off, and so all of that soil, all of that grassland it developed as a co-evolved system between bison and grasslands. And Ledyard Stebbins, who was a very well-known plant evolutionary biologist, died about 20 years ago, I suppose. But Stebbins had a paper in which he made the case that there are grasslands in the Great Plains. Northern Great Plains are a product of this co-evolved system with grasses and bison. And bison move across the grasslands foraging, and so there's sort of this intermediate disturbance hypothesis that stimulates production after grazing, and sequesters carbon into the soil, and does an amazing job of it. So we started thinking, well, what, maybe we could invest in a grassland. And so we found this ranch. It's called the Wild Rose Ranch, which is right next to the McIntyre Ranch, which is near south of Lethbridge. And it was up for sale, and it was beat up. So this is me in 2009 on the Wild Rose Ranch, and it was about maybe 20% bare ground. It was very heavily abused and overgrazed, so we got found some partners. Nature Conservancy Canada got us 500 grand to contribute to the purchase price. Alberta Conservation Association came up with $340,000. Alberta Fish and Game Association put in $100,000. But Society for Conservation Biology put $50,000 up, but with the stipulation that they were buying the carbon. And even at that time, we recognized, based on our estimates, how much carbon was likely to be there, that they were getting it really cheap. The going rate in Alberta for carbon right now is $40 per ton, but they should have been getting it for about $6 a ton. So we took the cattle off, and the rebound was spectacular. I mean, in the first year, all of these forbs came up, and it was remarkable to me how from that previous photo that I showed you, that it was just really beat up. And like I said, the rebound was amazing. And so we measured the carbon in the soil, and 150 sampling sites across this 390 hectare site, and came up, and we contracted with it's called Agate, I think is the name of it, here in Edmonton, that does the carbon work. But like I said, the rebound was spectacular, and it has kept up. And so we measured it at when we first bought the place, and then in 2010, 2012, and then just last year in 2021. And that carbon sequestration has kept up, and we have averaged 2.25 megatons or metric tons of carbon CO2 equivalents per hectare per year. And so, like I said, the market price is about $40 a ton, and going through these calculations, the Society for Conservation Biology got the carbon for $4.75 per metric ton. So, but as I mentioned, we took the cattle off, and so we had a really conservative grazing regime. We still kept some cattle on there from time to time, but only every other year, and then only during a window of time from the 15th of July until the 1st of September. We took the cattle off on the 1st of September because it's ACA and AFGA are partners in the investment, and the areas for hunting. Okay, so no cattle on there during the hunting season, September 1 through November, and no cattle before the 15th of July, because most nesting birds, waterfowl and ground nesting birds, sharp-tailed grouse, for example, need until about the 15th of July to get off their broods. So pretty short window of time, and every other year. So not a bad system from the standpoint of maximizing carbon sequestration and storage. And in fact, it kind of aligned with this thing called the Savory method. So Alan Savory was from Zimbabwe, and or he's still in Zimbabwe. But he has been promoting for 30 years this idea that the best way to manage grasslands is to hit them hard, hit it fast, and but for a short period of time, and then move the cattle on. And his idea was that you're kind of mimicking what happened with wildebeest in the case of East Africa, or in Saskatchewan, mimicking what the bison were doing on the landscape. That they'd come through in these massive herds. They'd probably, graze it really hard for a short period of time and then move on. The whole herd would move on. Lots of animals, so they were eating it all up and then moving on. And so this method called AMP grazing has become very popular in Saskatchewan and Alberta, Manitoba. It's been it got a lot of hype, but the statistics didn't support it very well. So the analyses that had been done were a bit of a fiasco, and it was so variable from year to year. And both Savory and Richard Teague wrote these articles saying, well, science just doesn't really work here. It's more of an art than it is a science. And that ticked me off. I've been hearing that kind of nonsense for my entire career, because I work in wildlife management quite a bit, and wildlife managers always make this claim, well, it's not a science, it's an art. Like I said, I don't accept that. And science has a role to play here, but it's a matter of having a proper sampling scheme that can accommodate how one might do AMP grazing. And so what is AMP grazing? So the idea is that with conventional grazing, you let the cattle loose out. Let's say you've got a couple thousand acres. Let the cattle loose out on your 2,000 acres, and they wander around and eat whatever they want. They tend to hit areas near salt or near water a lot harder. And there will be some parts of the ranch that won't get hit very much at all, but they're also highly selective, and so there will be they're increasers and decreasers, and so you have vegetation responding to the cattle grazing in a big way. But AMP grazing, on the other hand, involves having a number of pastures. And I've only got 4 here, but typically we'd have like 25 pastures. So, and you put the cattle in at high density, short period of time, like 4 days, and then move them on. And then graze this paddock, and then move on to the next paddock. So it's rotational grazing, but high intensity rotational grazing. So in Canada, it's becoming very popular. It's sometimes called holistic grazing. In Australia, they call it mob grazing. But it's high intensity, low frequency grazing, and it's become very popular, as I was saying. And the fact that a lot of cattle producers are really sold on it led me to believe maybe there is something to this. And the idea is to put up fencing. It's usually done with electric fencing, so you don't have this huge infrastructure of fencing that you have to put up, and it only takes a couple hours to run the electric fencing round. And so we did an analysis of what these people claiming to be AMP grazers are really doing. So we had Richard Teague and Steve Applebaum and a couple other people deciding what constituted AMP grazing. We identified initially 130 AMP grazers. So we went to the Organic Canada conference that was in Red Deer and met up with a whole bunch of these people, and everybody was claiming that they were AMP grazers. So then we got some data from each of them and started sorting through, and quite a few of them didn't quite meet our expectations. We wanted ranchers that had been at it for 10 years or so that the soils had had a chance to recover and align with the grazing system, and we wanted them to meet this criterion of short duration, high intensity grazing, move them on. And so then we set up this research program where we had 32 ranches with AMP grazing, and then we picked a neighboring ranch that was doing it however. And so we did a comparison between the AMP grazer and then what everybody else was doing. And so a paired design like that. And then we looked at forage production and water infiltration, carbon sequestration and storage, greenhouse gas fluxes, microbial activity, and also bird communities. So the vegetation as well as the bird communities. So this is the distribution of our sites. We have more in Saskatchewan than anywhere else. And they align largely with the aspen parkland. So there are a few down here in the mixed grass prairie, but most of our AMP grazers were in the aspen parkland. And so again, the idea is that the neighboring ranch was doing some kind of conventional grazing. Well, that said, almost all ranchers do some kind of rotational grazing. In fact, it's about 70%, I think, that of ranchers across the Northern Great Plains are doing some kind of rotational grazing. But it'll be like a slow rotation. They may, move their cattle once during the course of the season. But the AMP is very high intensity and very short period of time. Some of them are only a couple of days or 4 or 5 days that they'll have the cattle in there, and then they move them on. But they hit it hard. And the idea is that they eat everything so that you don't have the selective grazing that goes on under a more conventional grazing practice, and you don't have the increasers and decreasers. They slick it off. And so we did a comparison between the AMP grazers and the non-AMP grazers. And one of the disturbing things, and I was disappointed in this observation, that most everybody around with some kind of cultivation, and most ranchers had at some time disked it up or plowed it up and planted tame forage, and so seeding has disrupted quite a lot of both the AMP and the non-AMP ranches. So on average is about 20 years since there had been some kind of planting on the property. The AMP ranchers are more likely to use native seed species and a more diverse forage mix, but nevertheless, there had been interference in the past. Now, native grasslands are the best from the standpoint of carbon sequestration. The amount, so that you can see here on this histogram, the amount of litter and above ground biomass is higher, and the inorganic carbon content in a native grassland is higher. So there's more carbon in a native grassland than on introduced forage, and the worst is cropland. AMP ranches were larger, supported more cattle. Number of pastures by definition is way higher for AMP grazers, and the size of the pastures is small relative to non-AMP. And an interesting contrast here is that the stock density is 20-fold higher on AMP grazing, meaning when they put the cattle in, they put them in at very high density, short period of time, such that the stocking rate, meaning the number of AUMs per hectare over the ranch, is really not different. There's really no difference between the AMP and the non-AMP in stocking rate. But AMP ranches were grazed earlier and longer, so they're hitting it harder. It's more intensive management on AMP grazing. But the key metric, and this is Edward Bork is the one who came up with this metric based on our data, and that is the rest to grazing ratio. And this is really what defines AMP grazing, that we have this long rest period and a short grazing period. So this rest to grazing ratio is a key. So how does AMP grazing alter grassland production and forage use? And so AMP grazing enhances grassland biomass and litter. So there's more litter, there's more of a cushion, and so litter and above ground forage biomass is really important, because if you keep some vegetation on the surface, it reduces the amount of evaporative loss of moisture from the soil, and so it dampens the fluctuations that might occur from year to year, droughts and things like that, to have that litter and grassland biomass. But it also suggests that, you know, we've got the same stocking rates. Remember back here. See, the stocking rates are the same, but the stock density is very different. And so, the above ground difference, the above ground biomass is higher on the AMP grazing, and we're getting compensatory forage growth, hitting it hard, and then letting it rest for a long period of time increases the opportunity for the forage for the vegetation to grow. So we tracked the details of where the carbon was going by using carbon-13, so an isotope of carbon, and found that the AMP grazing sent more carbon into the roots, and so this high intensity defoliation tended to stimulate carbon allocation to the roots. Again, a really good thing in context of we're trying to evaluate this system for carbon sequestration and storage. So the next question was about water, and we've been told by Savory and Company that intense grazing for a short period of time tends to, the hoof action breaks up the soil and whatnot, and then it's left alone for say 80 days, and so you've got good vegetation cover that develops on there, and it absorbs more water. that was the argument, and so we tested that using this dual head water infiltrometer gadget that I'd never heard of before I did this project. But it basically sits right on the surface, and you put water in there and see how rapidly it goes down into the soil. And I won't dwell on it other than to say that one of the very important benefits of adaptive multi-paddock grazing is that it enhances water infiltration. So we already talked about how there's more litter in an AMP grazing system, so it tends to reduce the amount of evaporative loss, but also the soil conditions are such that it takes in more water. So that's a really important thing from the standpoint of trying to manage cattle in Saskatchewan, where sometimes you have a dry season, and this is a real buffer from the standpoint of ensuring that there's better moisture conditions. So water infiltration generally increased with the rest to grazing ratio, but it decreased with stocking rates. And the reason it decreased as stocking rates go up is because the bulk density gets higher. And if you're hitting it too hard, it increases the bulk density of the soil, and you have less infiltration. Now then, what about greenhouse gas emissions? Well, this was a bit of a surprise, and that is that methane that comes from urine and feces of the animals it is sucked up into the soils better in an AMP grazing system. And so it tends to compensate for the enteric fermentation by cattle that we have I get it methanotrophic bacteria that fix the methane into the soil, and it does so better when soil temperature is warmer. So in the summer in particular is when methane is being fixed into the soil better. Again, a bit of a surprise. And we want to avoid high stocking rates to minimize carbon loss. And again, these native grasslands are the best. They're better as methane sinks for sure. And so a non-cultivated native grassland is the best you can get. Those are very special places. So then Upama, who's from Nepal, Upama studied soil microbes, and this is out of my league. I don't do this kind of work, but Upama does, and so she's been educating me on how this goes. But AMP grazing alters the microbial community and tends to push it more toward a bacterial community as opposed to fungal. Ungrazed, undisturbed grasslands tend to have a higher fungal community. And the more disturbed they are, the more it tends to turn over more rapidly with a more bacterial system. And I can't tell you why that happens. It does. I don't understand enough about the microbial dynamics. I know it's a fact, but exactly why, I'd have to ask Upama to explain to you. But we have greater diversity of bacteria in the AMP grazed sites, and so these are like the Shannon-Weaver Index of Diversity on the left, and then the Simpson Index of Diversity. So they're just different metrics, same data, but we see greater diversity of bacteria in the AMP grazed sites, and the effect size is not really all that great here for the fungal response, but in general, the fungal response appears to be higher in the non-AMP grazing. So then what about the soil carbon? That's kind of the bottom line here. So we have this piece of equipment here that attaches to the back of a quad, and it takes these soil cores. They're about 4 or 5 inches in diameter and 1 meter deep. And so there are these tubes that we get out of this machine. And we took, well, over our study, I think we had 1,500 of these meter deep soil cores. And Lio, along with some lab techs that we got for him, plowed through all of these samples. And the upshot is that AMP grazing tends to sink carbon down deeper, and the AH horizon, meaning the topsoil, the black soil horizon, is about 1 meter deep, and so it's deeper in the AMP grazed system than in the non-AMP. So it's sinking the carbon down deeper where it's safer. It's going to be there. It can be there for thousands of years. But there's an interplay here with stocking rate as well. But AMP grazing is certainly beneficial at higher stocking rates. And so this is again the rest to grazing ratio. So 0 rest to grazing ratio means you're grazing it all the time. And you can see here the AH horizon depth is much less in when you have basically continuous grazing, and it's the highest when you have a long rest to grazing ratio. So given the audience, I suspect you've been anxiously wanting to hear about the bird consequences. Well, a lot of the reason that I got into this project and got interested in pursuing these issues of soil carbon relate to the fact that, you know, our grassland birds are declining at a precipitous rate. The two groups of birds in North America that are declining the most rapidly are grassland birds and aerial insectivores. And both of those groups are declining. Since 1970, they've declined like 70% overall. And some species, like the thick-billed longspur and the chestnut-collared longspur, have declined, like in Alberta, like 95% in the last decade. And so we wanted to evaluate AMP grazing and how it affected avian diversity. And I was a little worried about this because, you know, when you put those livestock in there at a, you know, say you've got a 25-acre paddock and you put 80 head in there for 5 days, they're just going to trample everything. There's nothing left. If there's the ground nesting bird there, it's toast. And so, you know, AMP grazing doesn't sound like a very good deal for grassland birds. Just to reiterate what I just got done telling you about the huge decline that we've seen in grassland birds, meadowlarks, for example, 3 and 4 meadowlarks are gone since 1970. So we use a point count sampling procedure on the AMP ranches and the non-AMP ranches, and recorded about 100 different species of birds in the study. But sorry, I kind of got off track a little bit. One of I mentioned that one of my motivations for doing this research was because of this enormous decline in grassland birds. It occurred to me that maybe we could figure out a way to use carbon credits to fund grassland conservation to push back against this huge loss of grasslands and loss of grassland birds. Now, how are you going to do that? Well, you find ways to get money to make incentives for managing grasslands, keeping cattle on grasslands as opposed to turning it into cropland. But different species of birds, and this may not be a surprise to you if you think about it a little bit, but different species of birds responded very differently. So here's our multi-paddock grazing in this column on the left, and then on the right, we've got our non-AMP ranches. And you can see some species do really well on multi-paddock grazing, bobolinks, grasshopper sparrows, LeConte sparrows, Savannah sparrows, Vesper sparrows, and meadowlarks. Okay, but then there are these other species like Sprague's pipit and some of the long spurs do actually better on the comparative ranches. Well, how could it be that any grassland bird is going to survive this onslaught of grazing pressure that occurs on AMP grazing? Well, the reason is, you've got maybe 30 paddocks on an AMP ranch, and by the 15th of July, you haven't yet touched any, half of the ranch yet. So there's been about half of the ranch that has had no grazing at all until the 15th of July. And by then, many of the birds have got their broods off. That's kind of the cut point that Ducks Unlimited uses, is 15th of July. So we had good response by some species like bobolinks that do well and don't graze it until the 15th of July. And these other species, meadowlarks and whatnot. But there are other species that do best in a short sward, really heavily grazed kind of system, or in a patchy, more patchy landscape where you've got the increasers and decreasers, and the effective grazing is more heterogeneous. Well, so the ones that like the really heavy grazed stuff are like upland sandpipers, willets, long spurs, Sprague's pipit. So some of our species that are kind of in trouble do better in a fairly heavily grazed short sward system. So the ideal situation, I'm kind of jumping ahead here and make a recommendation at this stage, but the upshot, I think, is that the best scheme is to have a mix, have some ranchers doing one thing, other ranchers doing something else, and that way you maximize sort of the regional diversity of the grassland system. So what about the money? How are we going to be able to convince people to do this? Well, in Alberta, we've got about 362 million tons of carbon in grasslands. 95% of those are grazed, and we can calculate how much this carbon's worth at $50 a ton. So Justin Trudeau, as you know, has imposed this carbon tax that Mo thinks is such a great deal, and it went up to $40. Was it this year or last year? At any rate, $40, and so it's supposed to go up, keep going up to $110 a ton. And so, if we're getting 2.25 tons per hectare, that means, you're going to be able to get ultimately about 50 bucks an acre carbon revenue for maintaining a grassland, a permanent grassland cover. So this is avoided conversion to keep it in grassland. But this is the ideal, and we work toward getting a carbon protocol with the Climate Action Reserve that's in California, and it was passed. And so you can apply for carbon credits. You get about one carbon credit per year per acre is about what you could get. In practice, people have had trouble getting that much, and the paperwork is onerous. It's not a good system. I mean, it exists, but few people are using it just because of the onerous paperwork and the way that it's set up. And this is in my opinion, tragic that we've got this carbon tax. Justin and company have designed this grand scheme, but we don't even have a carbon registry in Canada. Anyway, we need to have a carbon registry. It needs to facilitate and support ranchers who are doing the right thing, and the amount of revenue that they could get maybe could offset the risk of going to cropland. That's the most important thing, is to maintain what native prairie we've got. It's precious. And we need to restore permanent grassland cover on cultivated lands, especially marginal cultivated lands, put it back into grassland. We need to reduce stocking rates on degraded pastures. The idea is that A&P grazing mimics the pattern of use by bison, presumably. And like I said, we need a Canadian carbon registry. Now, for somebody my age, having an organization called CCR has a nice ring to it. And the worst thing that could possibly happen is converting grasslands to cropland. We lose carbon the minute you turn it over. The minute you plow it, we start losing carbon really fast, because you turn over the soil and you've got all these microbes that are just respiring. There's no while until you get stop them growing on it. It's just respiring, and there's no input of carbon into the soil. You're just losing carbon. And on average, on cultivated lands, croplands across the northern Great Plains of Canada, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta, we've lost between 40 and 50% of the carbon. And the worst thing you can do is convert to canola like this and turn it into cropland. The problem and the big barrier that we face, and I don't have a solution yet. I mean, this is something we worry about a lot, but the biggest problem right now are crop prices. So you can get about $330 an acre by raising canola. Well, you're not gonna get anything like that raising beef cattle on native grassland. It's just, we're not there, and we probably won't get there. So that's a major barrier. The whole business of private land ownership and the ability of a farmer to till and raise crops. How are you going to convince them to do otherwise? Anyway, this is probably the biggest hurdle to grassland conservation that we've got, is preventing conversion to cropland. Anyway, this project was funded by the AGGP program, Agricultural Greenhouse Gas Program by Agriculture and Agri-Foods Canada. So a federal program. They gave us about $3 million for this project over about a 3-year period. And I have to acknowledge my spectacular team of colleagues from University of Alberta. Tim Dobert, well, these are students on this line, but the UA colleagues here, Edward Bork, J.C. Cahill, Cam Carlisle, Scott Chang, Scott Jeffries, and Deborah Davidson were just amazing to work with. And we got a lot of work out of this project and a lot of publications, and it's just been, it's been a real eye opener. So anyway, that's the end of my presentation. I'm more than happy to entertain discussion and try to answer your questions. So Fran, do you want to field